I don't know about you, but I'm finding in this day and age that the definition of family is getting a little confusing. It's getting a little muddled, and even in my own life, I realize that was true when I look back at my history. I'm a child of divorce. That means I was born into a traditional family, mom, dad, and 4 kids. And then my parents divorced when I was 9 years old, and I became a child in a single-parent family. And a lot of people here would understand what that's like and know the challenges. Mom raising us and 4 kids. Then my mother remarried, and that was complicated because then we had a stepdad and my mom and 4 kids, and then 4 more stepkids. So I had 2 stepbrothers and 2 stepsisters. And then when I was about 18, she divorced my first stepfather, and we went back to being a single-parent family. And then when I was myself 20 years old, I got married, and my wife and I formed a new family, and we had 2 children of our own. So there's another traditional family. And then about 9 months later, my mother got married again. So I have a new stepfather and 4 new stepbrothers and sisters, 2 of whom are adopted black girls, very nice young ladies, but it's completely outside my experience. And then my brother gets married to a Chinese lady, and they have a child together, and my sister is single. My younger brother, on the other hand, lives common law with his partner. So family is a little bit muddled for me. There's a whole bunch of different facets to that. And some of you, maybe most of you, understand what I'm talking about when you say, we're not even sure how to define what a family is anymore, are we? Where does it start? What's it all about? Just add insult to injury and remind me of how old I am. Now my daughter's married too. And she's sitting here with my son-in-law Josh this morning. Things keep changing all the time. Families keep changing all the time. In our passage today, Jesus has just finished teaching people about the heart of God, about who would be great in God's kingdom, about what matters to God, and how we should forgive one another, and we should, because we're forgiven, learn to forgive others. He's reminded us of the consequences of failing to forgive. And here he is, he's traveling now to Jerusalem. We're coming towards the end of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus has set his sights on the cross, where he knows what he's going to do. And it's at this moment, while he's traveling, and large crowds are still following him, he's still healing the sick and seeing lives changed, that we really see God's heart on display. While he's even going to the cross, he's still taking care of people. He's still showing God's love. He's still creating a family. And here's the irony. In the middle of that situation where people have just been reminded of forgiveness and grace and what it is to be great in God's kingdom, when they've just been reminded that Jesus came to reconcile people and build relationships, this is when the Pharisees show up, and when they come to Jesus and say, but what about divorce? Man, it's like throwing a bomb into the middle of the situation. It doesn't make any sense that they're bringing this question up right at this time. God's in the middle of reconnecting people. And instead, the Pharisees wanted to talk about breaking people up. When you look at verses 1 to 3 of our passage, you can see this just so clearly encapsulated. He's just finished the sayings. He's just finished teaching. It's not like this was a few days before. He's just finished talking. If you were reading the comics, this would be the speech bubble still hanging in the air, right? And that's the moment they come to him. The crowds are there. They've just been healed. And the Pharisees come up to him and test him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? It's really a discussion about the heart of God, isn't it? They want to know what they can get away with, what God expects, what he wants from them. How important is the family? How important is marriage? They want to trap Jesus really in a legal discussion of, well, one guy says this and one guy says that. What do you think? But Jesus came not to enforce the law, but to free us from it. To open up our minds and hearts to a God who loves us so much that he gives us gift after gift after gift. At the heart of the family, what we really find is God's gift of marriage, and also his gift of grace, and his gift of truth. Look at the gift of marriage with me. Look at verse 4 again. Next slide, please, Ben. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Now that's a really interesting place to start, because they say, well, is it lawful for any and all reasons to get divorced? And he starts by saying, back to trial. To begin with, you're asking if it's okay for a man to divorce his wife, and I'm going to start by saying men and women were created equal in the sight of God. It's not men before women, it's not men over women. In God's design, in God's plan, we are equal. Not the same, but equal. That was God's design. That's where Jesus begins. He says, you want to talk about the law? Let me tell you about my Father's plan, His design, the way He set it up in the beginning. That's what my Father's interested in. He goes on to verse 5 and says, therefore, remember the question, therefore? What's a therefore? Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, friends, I'm a child of divorce. I've seen two of them. When Debbie and I first met, we began dating and then got serious and started talking about marriage. She will remember that I looked at her and said, listen, I've been through divorce. I've seen the damage it caused. I've experienced it personally. And I'm telling you that when I say till death do us part, what I really mean is you're going to have to kill me to get rid of me. Okay? And I'm still as serious about that after 21 years this August as I was the day I said it to her. This is an absolute commitment for me. That marriage is not something that you can just say, okay, we slapped it together because it felt good at the time. Now see you later, Charlie. I'm not having fun anymore. The importance of family is built on this bedrock of God's gift of marriage. Every single human being sitting here this morning and on this planet finds their origin in a family, yes? Right? Now, we're not defining what family is, whether it's one mom and a dad, all that stuff. We're saying that it started with some kind of a family. And that matters so much that God, at the creation of the world, when He made man and woman, He said, okay, this is my plan for you guys. Two together forever. One flesh. Now, that's not like Velcro where you rip it apart and it looks fine afterwards, okay? If you've ever glued two pieces of wood, it's closer to that, but even that's not close enough. You try to break that glue break, what happens? It tears the wood, it frays it on both sides, right? It's something that if you try to tear it apart, it's going to wreck it. That it doesn't come apart intact. And anybody who's been through divorce knows this. This is true. The damage it causes personally and to the people around you is immense. God's gift of marriage is something that's supposed to be permanent. But yet a covenant is not just a contract. This world wants to make marriage a contract where you sign a piece of paper just like buying a car, and after so long, if you're tired of it, you can just trade it in for a new one. Right? And friends, that's not God's plan. That's not what He intended at all. In verse 6, He goes on to say, what therefore? There's that therefore again. God is joined together, let not man separate. And Jesus, this is the Son of God Himself, interpreting what God planned and saying, just in case you weren't clear on it the first time, here's the deal. If God made it, put it together, if God intended that to be true, then don't be tearing it apart. Marriage is too important for that. The family is too important for that. To just tear it apart. But the good news, friends, and this is very good news. My parents, when I was 9 years old, they divorced. Just coming into the teen years, right? And I went to youth group when I was 13, like most kids did, and we went to a different church because my home church didn't have a youth group. And there were people in that church that were so concerned with the law, like these Pharisees, is it lawful? That they actually told me that my parents were going to hell because they'd been divorced. And I said, I can't reconcile that with these two people who know and love God and are just, the marriage didn't work. They tried their best to make it work. I don't know what to do with this as a teenager. And I realized we needed an answer for this question. And the answer is God's gift of grace. Because as important as marriage is, as permanent as it's supposed to be, there's more to it than simply saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes. She'll have to kill me to get rid of me. If you look at what it says in verse 7 and 9, next slide please, Ben. They said to him, in response to his explanation, this is how important marriage is, they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? And that was what the law said. You can go to the Old Testament, read Leviticus. That's what it says. That Moses said to his people, right, if you're going to get divorced, you've got to give your ex a certificate so she can prove, yes, I'm legally divorced. And it's kind of like today. You actually have to have documentation to prove whether you're married or single or divorced. I always wonder, what do you do if you've never been married? How are you supposed to sign that form? Because you have no evidence you're single. Nobody ever gives you at the government office, okay, here's where I check the box and they give me a form that says I'm single, right? I don't know what you do with that. But the point is, they come to him and they say, but Moses commanded us to do it this way. He said it's okay, basically. If it's a command in Scripture, it must be okay to get divorced, right? That's their argument. It seems like a rational argument. But they're still stuck on the law. Jesus responds to them. He says that because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed. Notice that. I have it underlined in the PowerPoint. They say, why did Moses command us? And Jesus says, no. Your hearts were hard, so Moses allowed. Not because it was God's plan. God didn't change the rules and say marriage doesn't matter anymore. You can just get it when you want to. But He did allow for the fact that sometimes one or both parties have such a hard heart they will not change, that it cannot be repaired. The relationship is too broken. And so Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But then he reminds them, but from the beginning it wasn't so. That doesn't mean it's now God's plan. It was never God's intent that divorce would be a reality. But He allowed it. Grace, even in the Old Testament, before Jesus came, before Jesus died on the cross for our sins, before our sins could even be forgiven under that blood shed by Jesus Christ, grace was extended and recognized that in the reality of human existence, sometimes the relationship is so fractured that it must be ended. And friends, that is a great comfort to me, having a mother who's divorced twice, let me tell you. Because I know my mother's commitment was so great to her first marriage to my father that they suffered and had 4 children together, did whatever they could to try to fix it. And when they finally accepted it couldn't be fixed, they were broken for years. They understood how high the cost was. But they also understood that they just couldn't make it work. And I know that when my mother married an alcoholic man and went for almost 8 years married to that man, that she did everything in her power. We lived in a women's interval home for a summer because she was so determined to fix her marriage. She didn't give it up easily. She didn't take it lightly. Marriage, family, she understood were so critically important. But because of grace, there's an allowance that sometimes it just can't work. And because of grace, that means we can be forgiven. Because of grace, that means your life isn't over because your marriage ended. He reminds us of this, that it wasn't God's plan, but it is allowed under grace. And that's a tremendous gift. Anybody here that's divorced or been through divorce knows what a gift that is, to know that you are forgiven, that whatever happened is in the past, that you can move forward with your life with God's blessing. Because God has allowed this. But Jesus then adds to it, doesn't He? He says, I say to you. When Jesus says, I tell you the truth, or I say to you, you should pay attention. Just like the therefore thing. He says, I tell you the truth, or I say to you, you should be saying it. This is the words of God on earth, speaking directly to you and I. So He says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. This is really critical that we get this one right, because that passage, this translation, I'm not really happy with. Because the phrase there, sexual immorality, we only equate that with my spouse cheated on me, don't we? And it'd be very easy to think that meant that's the only excuse, that you should put up with your husband or your wife beating you, you should put up with addiction, you should put up with unfaithfulness in other ways. That's not the case. That word in the original language is porneia, which you might guess is where we get our word pornography from. Okay? And it carries 2 really important meanings. The first one being unfaithfulness. That you're unfaithful to the promises you made. That you're unfaithful to the covenant relationship you're a part of. Okay? That takes a lot of forms. I can tell you that when my mother was trying to make her marriage work with my alcoholic stepfather, he was unfaithful to his marriage vows. He promised to love, honor, and cherish, you know? And that wasn't happening. The second part of this word porneia, to understand, is selling yourself into slavery. In the ancient days, if you couldn't pay your debts, one option was to sell yourself as a slave, and that money would be used to pay your debt. And that's the second part of it. You're being unfaithful, and you're selling yourself into something you shouldn't be part of. And So when we talk about addiction, when we talk about abuse, when we talk about neglect, and don't miss this, friends, neglect is as much a form of abuse as anything else. I've seen a lot of marriages where one of the other partners is just trying to survive and the other one ignores them. It's just two roommates living in the same house. Friends, that's not God's intent. Marriage is God's gift to us. But His grace is also a gift to us. And I want to tell anybody here who's ever been divorced that if you think about this verse properly, you're going to understand that if your partner was unfaithful to the vows they made, then you're entirely within the will of God to have done what you did, and you can receive His grace and know that you didn't do anything wrong. This is so personal for me after watching my mother, watching her struggle, watching her be rejected, watching my father not be welcomed into membership of any church for years. We must get this one right. Because we live in a society where we often talk about this number we believe to be true, that 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's not that bad, actually. It's only about 35 or 36% in Canada, but it's still really bad. We must claim this truth, that God gave us the gift of marriage. He also gave us the gift of grace, so that the family could survive even though it's changing and been changed. And lastly, He gave us the gift of truth. Next slide, please, Bennett. The disciples said to Him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. They looked at it and said, if marriage is such a serious business, if this is such a critical matter, if family is so important that it would be safer, we'd be better off not having to deal with it at all. And you know what the truth is? Actually, Paul sort of agreed with that statement. When we read in 1 Corinthians, Paul said, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried person is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. To marry is to accept, here it is, a gift from God. But to be single is also a valid path in life. You need to understand this. There's a lot of single people saying, but it's so lonely, you don't understand. Trust me, I've been married for 21 years. It's not a whole lot easier than being single sometimes. And some of you have been married for 30, 40, 50 years, and you know what I'm talking about. Marriage is really hard work, and it does split your focus. It does mean that you can't commit yourself 100% to God, because I'll tell you what, if I, as your pastor, decide to marry myself to the church and never come home, my wife's not going to be very happy with me. In fact, you shouldn't be happy with me, because she's the one I committed myself to, and I should put her first, shouldn't I? Right? When we know that reality, we know that there's a huge responsibility there. And the single person is free to focus on that freedom and on what God has for them. But the single person is also free, if the Lord provides, to receive again the gift of marriage because of the gift of grace. The truth is, this is difficult. Jesus says, not everyone, in the italics there, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. Not everyone can handle the truth, as the movie said. You can't handle the truth. Some people just can't take it. They can't accept it. I think the Pharisees were like that. But nonetheless, marriage is too important for us to pretend that whatever happens to people doesn't matter. For us to act as if when a marriage explodes, it's just what happens. And for us to ignore the pain and the damage that happens as a result. We need to be a people who minister to those who are married and struggling, and to those who are married and want to grow stronger, and to those who have been through divorce and are wondering where they even fit anymore. Jesus goes on to say, there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. What's he saying? There's some people that from birth they were meant to be alone. They were meant to walk through this life alone. There's some people who, through the circumstances of life, have ended up alone. And there's some who have chosen to be alone for God's sake. Think of our Catholic brothers and sisters and the priests and the nuns who make that choice to be alone so that they can serve God with their whole life. Let the one who's able to receive this, receive it. Interesting how he changes the wording, isn't it? First he says, not everyone can receive this, and then he says, let the one who is able to receive this, receive. I'm here to tell you today that family is too important for us to ignore the gift of marriage or the gift of grace. We must claim these and the gift of truth. And I want to just offer you a little tool this morning, if I can. Something that will help you in relationships with your family, no matter whether it's your marriage relationship or with your parents or your children or your friends. There's a book written back in 1992 that's just as relevant today as it ever was. It's called The 5 Love Languages, written by a man named Gary Chapman. I encourage you to pick it up. But Ben, can you go to the next slide, please? He suggests that we all have 5 basic ways we express love to people and we receive love. And they are words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. And when you think about that, what I want to encourage you to do today is to go home and just ask yourself the question, which of those 5 things is the way I like to be loved the most? For me, it's words of affirmation. You folks know that. I talked about the calendar Debbie made me a while back. And then I said to her, listen, don't get me stuff for Christmas. It means nothing to me. She made this amazing calendar, 365 days on the course, because it's a full year. And every day she's written something that's encouraging to me. I love you. I want you to know how special you are. She even calls me handsome a couple times. When I get that, every day I read it. It hangs right by my computer at home. Every day I'm down there, and every day I read it, and every day I know that my wife loves me. Okay. If I gave her a calendar like that, she would go, whatever. But I'll tell you what, when I buy her something, flowers or a gift, she just lights right up. Some of you just want quality time with that person you love. You just want to spend time with them. And that to you is love. And if you don't get that quality time, you feel like they don't care. For some of you, that means if your partner says, I want to go work out west, you've got to say, no way can you do that, buddy, because I won't feel your love. Okay. Some of you, it's acts of service. When your loved one, your partner, does something for you, does the dishes, maybe. You go, hey, man, they care. And some of you, it's just physical touch. You need that hug. You need that kiss. You need that, it might be a handshake. You need some kind of affirmation. You need a pat on the back. You need somebody to touch you to say they care. Now, here's the key for these love languages. First, you need to understand what yours is. And you probably have one really important one and one that's secondary. Nobody's just wired for just one of these. But the important part is learning not just to know your own, but to speak your loved one's language. My wife's family origin is in Germany and mine's Dutch. Now imagine if we spent every day with me speaking Dutch and her speaking German, how much communication would go on, right? Now those are fairly close linguistically, but they're not the same language, are they? And probably we wouldn't get our full meaning across, right? But on the other hand, what happens if I learn how to speak German and she learns how to speak Dutch? At that point, she's speaking to me in my language, I'm speaking to her in hers, and we're probably communicating better than ever before, right? So here's the task. If family is important, if God gives the gift of marriage, the gift of grace, and the gift of truth, here's the truth. We all need to be loved and we need to express love. And if you can learn what your language is and then tell your loved ones, this is what speaks to me. Friends, we'll be communicating on a whole new level. And we will be proving how much family really matters because we'll be making a commitment to making it work. My son is physical touch, hands down. He likes hugs. Everybody go hug him after church. He loves that. no, he gets embarrassed easily, so just kidding. but very much, it's physical touch. You can tell. And you probably know already in that list. It means in the world when somebody just says a word, hey, you did a good job. Right? Or when they just give you that pat on the back. The guys that like sports know what it's the smack on the butt after the home run. It's important that we learn to speak each other's language. Because God has a plan for us. He gave us the gift of family. He rooted it in marriage. He backs it with grace, and He calls us to the truth. And I just encourage you, don't back away from the challenge. After 21 years of marriage, I and anybody married longer than me can tell you the same thing. It's absolutely worth it. Would you pray?